the Unitarian Universalist Church of Worcester podcast. We are a community built on love, hope, and justice. Our goal is to inspire people to take on the challenges of a changing world. Each week we'll bring you a reflection from our minister, the Reverend Aaron Payson, recorded during our Sunday service. Maybe it'll move you, challenge your thinking, or even stir up a little righteous indignation. That's all welcome here. Thanks for listening.
So, yes, I'm the Easter Bunny. I'm the Easter Bunny. We are the Easter Bunnies. And the story that I want to tell you today, I think my friend here will understand too, is the year that I almost forgot how to hop. Can you imagine a bunny that does not know how to hop? No. Well, you see, even magical rabbits have hard seasons. One winter, the snow fell so heavier and so deeper, and it was so cold that by the time the snow disappeared, my paws were tired, my whiskers drooped, and when I tried to hop, I only managed to sort of a slow, wobbly hop. You know what I'm talking about. Not very bunny-like at all. I worried, how can I bring spring if I can't hop into it? So I did what any sensible rabbit would do. I went looking for help. First, I asked the birds. They were practicing their spring songs, warming up their voices. I wonder what birds warming up their voices sound like. I love the fact that in this congregation there are no caws, right? There are no crows, right? No turkeys. Yeah, see, there you go, right? Had to call them forth, right? I said, excuse me, please tell me how you remember songs after such a long winter. A tiny sparrow fluttered right down beside me and chirped. We don't remember it. We listen to it. The world hums a tune, and we join in. I closed my eyes, and I listened. And under the thawing ground, I heard it, a faint, patient hum, like the earth whispering. We hear it. Not yet, but soon. Next, I asked the flowers. They were still tucked in the ground, but I knew where to find them. What does a flower tucked in the ground look like? Can you make one yourself, tucked in the ground, like a flower? Listen, just turn around, cover up like you're under the covers, throw the sheet over your head. That's what we're talking about. And I said, hello, down there. How do you know when it's time to bloom? And the crocus That wonderful little purple flower that comes out regardless of whether there's no snow or snow. You know the one I'm talking about. Answered in a very sleepy voice, "We don't rush. We rise when the sun feels warm enough to trust." Warm enough to trust. I tucked that wisdom into my fur. And then I asked the eggs. Yes, I talk to eggs. You would too if you had my job. How do you stay brave in the dark before you hatch, I asked. And one egg wiggled and said, "We don't know what's coming, but we know we're not alone." And that's enough. I felt my whiskers lift a little. Finally, I found some children to ask. I peeked into this room where they were all gathered, and not almost like this one. In fact, exactly like this one, right? And I saw children, they were playing, and some of them were like drawing on the floor, the sidewalk chalk. And I said to one of them, "Why are you drawing flowers before real ones come?" And that child looked up at me and said, "Because sometimes you have to imagine spring before you can see it." And suddenly I felt something inside me stretch, wide, and wiggle, and lighten. And I tried to hop. A small one, and then a bigger one. And then a hop so joyful it sent me tumbling into a patch of last year's leaves. I laughed, and the children laughed too. And the earth seemed to laugh with us. And that's how I learned to hop again. Not because winter ended. Not because everything was easy.
Sit down. That's too tall.
That's too tall.
No.
That's right, see? Not because everything is easy. But because the birds reminded me to listen. And the flowers reminded me to trust. And the eggs reminded me I wasn't alone. And the children reminded me to imagine what's possible. Spring didn't arrive in a single moment. So today it arrived in many small kindnesses shared between all of us. So today as we celebrate Easter and spring and new beginnings, I bring you eggs full of color and sweetness and hope, not because I'm magical, but because we all are. Every one of us helps to bring spring into the world. Now, are you ready to hop over and find your eggs? Shall we send them forth? Bye-bye, bunny friend. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere. A quick change artist I ain't. Those onesies are not only tough, but they cling. How those of you who wear pantyhose survive, I have no idea. Of the empire. We will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, that tried to vanquish insecurity for a few and cared little for the penury of many. We'll be known as a culture that taught and rewarded the amassing of things, that spoke little, if at all, about the quality of life for people, other people, for dogs and rivers. All the world, in our eyes, they will say, was a commodity. And they will say that this structure was held together politically, which it was. And they will say also that our politics was no more than an apparatus to accommodate the feelings of the heart, and that the heart in those days was small and hard and full of meanness. I came across this poem by Mary Oliver written in 2008, and I paused. The poet whose words inspired me and so often reflected the lessons of the gifts of nature had written a lament that still seems all too real these 18 years hence. I suspect it was a response, at least in part, to the Great Recession which rippled across our country and our world that year and the year prior. But it was more than that. It is, for me, a timeless description of empire. And in preparation for this morning, it also serves as a reminder of how Rome in general and Jerusalem in particular operated in the first century of the Common Era. The cultural and political landscape, which is the backdrop to the Easter story reverenced by Christian communities on this day and during this season. For me, it frames the essential truths that are made plain in the narrative of the death and resurrection of the prophet. Truths that are as timeless as his message, reflecting something far more essential in nature, including our nature, than that which the poet laments. Even the rocks and the stones themselves will sing, says Scripture. If read properly, this, I think, is also the poet's intent. For beneath every lamentation is a cry to realize the possibilities yet born into a moment of grief and pain. A cry for possibility, that something new, something life-giving and loving is also achievable if we have but eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts to understand. Naming a burden awakens potential. And while so much of Christian theology seems tied to a personal relationship with this prophet, we often forget that Jesus was born into and ministered out of a tradition which cherished liberation as a communal reality, a realization that gives a different texture to the death and resurrection motifs within the tradition that carries his name. This point is often missed when stories of Jesus' miraculous healings are recalled in order to underscore the need for such a personal relationship. What often goes unnoticed is the end of those scenes when the one who is healed is told to go and tell others. On the surface, it seems like straightforward evangelism, doesn't it? Go tell others what the prophet did. But in another context, the command to go and tell is an instruction to take your liberation to the community you call home. Go and be with those you love. For the surest effect of the ostracization of empire is separation. To be an outcast is to be cast away from essential relationships, making the current hideousness of detention a primary example of empire's logic. So much of what is recalled by the Christian church during Holy Week seems to reflect this critique of power. Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, a lament for the lack of a consciousness of peace. Riding into town knowing what is going to happen wasn't what the crowd expected, and the realization that most of them who greeted him with Hosanna would be asking for him to be crucified only days later. There's that scene of the cleansing of the temple, you know the one I'm talking about, which is so mired in theological personalism that we completely overlook that it wasn't about those who were changing money at all. It was a castigation of religious authorities who were in service to the empire, for whom the temple was an escape, a den, if you will, shielding them from the consequences of their collusion with political authority, condemnation that he reiterated the next day as he was confronted by those very same authorities who, after that encounter, began to plot to kill him. The meal that he shared with his disciples in the upper room reflected the ethic that is at the core of his ministry. Remember that many of Jesus' most profound lessons were communicated in the context of a communal gathering that often included food. That loaves and fishes story, you remember? And the miracle of that, depends on the context you come into, or you discover it from. For those who want to personalize it and want to proclaim that it's all about Jesus' capacity, they'll say he blessed the loaves and the fishes, and there was enough for everyone. For those who come at it and say the story is really about Jesus' capacity to bless us, recognize that the act of asking people to share what they have often produces far more abundance by the end of it than by the beginning. I've told this story before in this pulpit, but I had a colleague who was traveling on a train through Transylvania, and she had a little wooden tray on which she put a little piece of cheese and sliced up an apple, and she took a piece of each and then passed it forward. And they passed it forward, and it went all the way down the car, across the aisle, back up the aisle, and came back to her, and by the time it was back to her, it was overflowing with food. I tell you, I think that's miraculous. When we can inspire each other to be compassionate and giving, and remember that our most profound gift to this world is our capacity to be in service to that which is larger than ourselves, we engage in the miraculous. This whole idea of engaging the miraculous is really the essence of liberation, especially within a context that was fundamentally speaking to the reality of those on the margins of Roman culture and the society in Jerusalem. For those who were marginalized in Roman society, "Give us this day our daily bread," was not just a prayer but a necessity for survival. Along with decreasing one's debts, attaining food were two of the basic necessities of life for those who survived at the edge of community. So too did it reflect the great commandment that we love one another as we have been loved. It's important, I think, to note that much of the Gospel of Mark, one of the earliest Gospels from which the narrative arc of this story is reflected in the other synoptic Gospels, save John, is devoted to how much his disciples don't get it. Failure of discipleship occupies more than half of the verses describing the events from the Last Supper to Jesus' betrayal and arrest in the garden later the same evening. A reality that Unitarian Universalist Deacon Robert Cox once captured when he wrote, "Let's face it, every damn one of them was a loser." the remnants. Peter, hell, you couldn't even trust Peter. He'll cop out at the first opportunity, and the second and the third. Undependable and weak. That's Peter. He's not fit even to be a carpenter, and you couldn't even trust him with your tools. What do you do with a fellow like that? Put him in charge. Give him a big title. Say a prayer for him. So I love Peter, my poor rock. Failure of the faithful is if not outright complicity with religious and political authorities to maintain power through violence, seems a perpetual theme in the history that we know. One that is challenged ultimately by this particular narrative that we honor today. Jesus' arrest and persecution and crucifixion ultimately reflect an ethic of solidarity with those for whom this treatment was all too familiar. Modern evangelical Christian theology, turns this into a story of Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection as a demonstration of divine power to overcome physical death, and a demonstration of Jesus' divine nature in the process. I think such theology actually misses the point. For me, Jesus' death was an act of solidarity with those for whom witnessing or succumbing in such ways was a daily occurrence. It's a relational act, not a substitutionary one. And the purpose, which becomes most evident a day later, is to condemn the violence of empire as a means of control. To be clear, Roman society knew well the story of the empty tomb. Clemedes of Estephalia, Numa of Populius, Alcmene, Alimaxis, and Romulus were just some of the figures who disappeared from their place of burial or hiding. What's fascinating to me is how the story of Jesus' post-crucifixion appearances reflect a difference between all these well-known narratives of that day and the story of how the Easter moment is lived out. Not as a continuing call to hail Jesus as a king, but as a continuing call to be in solidarity in and with community that suffers. Remember that the vast majority of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances happen in community, save for the conversation between Jesus and Mary in the garden, just sort of that sideline conversation among couples as far as I'm concerned. You know, you can hear her saying, "What on earth are you doing here?" Right? And him saying, "Shh, go tell others." Courage is the ability to move beyond what fails us and how we fail each other, and the work toward those conditions that manifest the trajectory of our own divine capacity, to be in solidarity with and a force within the universe which compels us to love more than to hate, to give more than to receive, to share more than to hoard, to care more than to curse, and to companion more than to control. The miracle of Easter isn't that Jesus appeared beyond death. There are many such stories from antiquity. It is that what he taught continues to live in the hearts and minds of many. Memory is a miracle and a powerful motivation. Moving forward, I think the challenge is ultimately about how we carry such memory. On that first Easter, when Jesus comes into the presence of his disciples in Galilee, I imagine that his essence became real because in the midst of their shared grief, they shared stories about their experiences. You and I have been in these contexts. When we gather to mourn, and in the process begin to tell stories that bring the person who is gone alive in us and between us. And how often those gatherings begin with tears and end with laughter. Because there is something miraculous about the joy of carrying that memory and that ability to be able to reflect what is most important about an individual beyond their earthly existence. Many question whether or not the body, where do we go after we die? And I can't give you a firm answer, but what I can be firm about is part of what your afterlife is how you're carried by the community who loves you and remembers you and continues to honor you by trying to continue to accomplish the things that were important to you. And we all have moments where we have experienced that, yes? And every one of us wishes at that moment in our own demise that somehow the gift of our living is bestowed upon those who survive, so that there is meaning beyond the moment of death. Remember the Easter Bunny story this morning? How on earth are you going to forget that? And I guarantee you will never, ever unsee it. And I know that there are certain people here in the back that are going to make pictures in perpetuity. So I know what's going to happen on my deathbed. People are going to be scrolling going, "Remember this?" And I will smile and say, "Exactly. And I hope you do too." That story is the essence of relational theology. When we come into the presence of those we trust, when we open up about our own trials and fears, when we listen for the wisdom of others' experiences and recall the essence of our own capacity to thrive, we act in holy ways. On this Easter, may we each be blessed to find our way to those who remind us of our best and most faithful selves. And in that process, may we each have the opportunity to reflect the wisdom that is the product not only of our own experience, but all of the experience we carry in us, because others came before us and left us to be their legacy. That's the stuff of resurrection. The miracle of this seasonal moment when the earth itself sings back to us the essence of life continuing within us, between us, and beyond us. The possibility of that new life itself is the afterlife of love. Amen. And blessed be.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're just crossing our path, either new to this congregation or curious about Unitarian Universalism, check out our website, uucworcester.org. You'll find lots of information there about our beliefs, the 8 guiding principles, religious exploration for children and adults, our social action initiatives, and the many groups we offer to help people connect and have fun. And consider joining us in person or online on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We'd love to meet you.